3 nights, one promise, and a single act by J.D. Vance at the border that changed the course of a $47 billion battle. It wasn't a speech broadcast to millions. It wasn't a headline crafted for clicks. It was a moment, silent, raw, and unseen by most, that rippled across a nation already torn between security and compassion. Picture it, midnight on the third night, the desert wind carrying the weight of uncertainty. J.D. Vance, alone at the border fence, faced not just steel and sand, but the invisible line between duty and conscience. What did he do, standing there under that cold moon, that history will never forget? Tonight we take you inside that moment, a dramatized journey inspired by real debates, real stakes, and real emotions. While the story you're about to hear blends fiction with fact to capture the spirit of these times, every heartbeat of courage, fear, and hope is drawn from the truth of what so many Americans feel. This is not just about a man. This is about a promise that echoes far beyond the border. Stay with us, because this is a story worth every second of your time and every beat of your heart. The House chamber had never felt this heavy, the kind of silence that didn't soothe. It suffocated. Rows of lawmakers sat stiffly in their seats, their faces set like stone, their eyes darting across the room as if searching for cues on how to breathe. The only sound was the soft, persistent click of cameras, a rhythm like a distant clock counting down to something no one dared name. The grand chamber, bathed in the glow of overhead lights, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of what was coming. The air was charged, as if the walls themselves could feel the divide. And then he rose. J.D. Vance didn't rise with dramatic flair. He didn't slam a fist on the lectern or clear his throat for attention. He stood with a kind of quiet resolve that, oddly, made him impossible to ignore. The cameras pivoted toward him, lenses focusing in like predators locking onto prey. Every eye in the chamber turned, drawn by something they couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the stillness of him amid the storm. When he spoke, it was not with the booming voice of a man trying to dominate a room. His voice was steady, measured, but carried a gravity that settled deep in the chest of anyone listening. The kind of voice that didn't demand your attention, it earned it. "If we forget the Americans who live at the border," J.D. said, his words slicing clean through the tension like a blade, "we forget who we are." No slogan, no applause line, just truth laid bare. For a heartbeat, the chamber stayed frozen. Then the reaction rippled. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. A few lawmakers nodded slowly, as if the words gave shape to something they'd felt but never said aloud. Others, their jaws tight, scowled as though the statement was a betrayal of alliances they'd long since made. You could almost see the calculations flashing behind their eyes. What does he stand to gain? What does this mean for us? Is he challenging the party, or all of us? Beyond the chamber, through the thick glass of history-laden doors, the frenzy had already begun. News anchors outside spoke breathlessly into microphones, their voices competing with the growing hum of a crowd gathering on the Capitol steps. The labels were swift and sharp. J.D. Vance, hero or political opportunist? Vance's border speech, bold stand or reckless gamble? Ohio's senator stirs a hornet's nest on Capitol Hill. Inside, J.D. remained still at the lectern. His eyes scanned the room, not in defiance, but with something closer to quiet expectation. Or was it challenge? His hands rested lightly on the wood, no notes before him, no prepared script to fall back on. Just the weight of the promise he'd spoken. And in that promise, 1,000 unspoken questions hung in the air. Would his words spark action or backlash? Would the headlines tomorrow hail him as a voice of reason, or would they paint him as a man who dared too much at the wrong time? What was it J.D. Vance saw at the border? What truth had he witnessed that gave his voice this quiet force? And why did it feel, to everyone watching, like this was only the beginning of something far larger? Something that no one, not even J.D. himself, could fully control? The chamber, the cameras, the country held its breath. And then, as the chamber seemed to exhale and return to its familiar murmur, J.D. Vance stepped down from the lectern. There was no victory smile, No glance back at those who had nodded or those who had scowled. He moved with the same quiet resolve that had carried him to that podium, his footsteps measured, as if each one marked the crossing of an invisible threshold. From words to consequence. The heavy doors swung open, and the storm waited for him. The reporters descended like a wave, their voices crashing over one another. "Senator Vance, are you defying your party? Do you stand with Trump or against him? Hero or hypocrite, Senator?" The glare of cameras lit his face, sharp and relentless, as though trying to strip away whatever armor his calm might provide. But JD didn't flinch. He didn't lash out or match insult with insult. Instead, he lifted his chin just slightly, his gaze unwavering, and repeated what he'd said moments before. "If we forget the Americans who live at the border, we forget who we are." No elaboration, no spin, just the same promise, steady as stone, spoken once again into the chaos. The storm followed him as far as the Capitol steps, then thinned as the press was forced to stop at the barricades, their shouts fading into the night. JD kept walking, each step taking him further from the noise, but not from the weight of what had begun. By the time he reached his office, the building had settled into its usual after-hours quiet, the kind that made the halls feel larger, emptier. He entered without turning on the overhead light, letting the city's distant glow filter through the tall windows. His eyes found it immediately, the framed photograph that sat on the far corner of his desk. The image was simple, a small Ohio farm, fields golden in the afternoon sun, a weathered barn standing against a sky that seemed to go on forever. His grandfather's farm, his roots. JD stared at it for a long moment, the noise of the reporters still echoing faintly in his head, mingling with the words he'd spoken. That farm had taught him about promise, about loyalty, about the kind of quiet strength that didn't need applause to be real. Tonight, those lessons felt closer than ever. He had only just lowered himself into the chair, the tension of the day pressing into his shoulders, when the phone on his desk rang. The sound was stark in the stillness, sharp enough to pull him from his thoughts. He hesitated a breath, then picked up. "Senator Vance?" The voice was worn, rough around the edges, but steady. A mayor, JD recognized it at once. A border town. "We're hanging on by a thread out here. I don't know if anyone else in that chamber tonight heard it, but I did. Don't let them forget us, please." JD felt the weight of those words settle alongside the promise he'd already spoken. There was no speech to give in return, no headline to chase, just a quiet reply. "I won't." And as he placed the receiver down, his reflection caught in the dark window. Blending with the lights of the city beyond, he whispered what had already become his private vow. "I said it. Now I have to live it." The night stretched ahead, heavy with the knowledge that promises spoken in a chamber meant little unless lived in the world beyond. And as the city hummed softly in the distance, JD Vance sat alone, the quiet around him no longer heavy with tension, but with purpose. The city outside JD's office seemed to hold its breath that night, as if aware that something fragile had shifted beneath its foundations. The glow of the Capitol dome, the steady flicker of traffic along the avenues, the hum of a nation's capital, all of it felt different now, touched by the weight of words spoken hours before. But inside, the world refused to pause. Screens lit the dim room, broadcasting an unending stream of images that felt as relentless as the crisis itself. Across the monitors, headlights snaking across the desert as groups moved north under cover of darkness. Drone footage of border crossings swelling beyond control. Small towns near the line, their streets choked with buses, their shelters overflowing, their leaders pleading into news cameras for help that seemed slow to come. Reporters' voices layered over the images, some with urgency, some with accusation. The border crisis deepens. Is Washington listening? Who will act? And who will pay the price? JD watched, silent, the scenes as familiar as they were painful. This wasn't a new story to him. He had seen it up close, felt the worry in the grip of ranchers' handshakes, heard the strain in the voices of border agents who'd long since stopped believing promises made in distant halls. But tonight the images seemed sharper, the stakes clearer. And as the news cycle churned, So did the weight of the promise he had spoken. A knock at the door broke through his thoughts, and his senior staff entered, faces tight with tension. They didn't need to ask if he'd seen the coverage. It played on every screen in the building, in every home, on every phone. The question was what came next. The room filled with competing voices, strategy spilling out in fragmented bursts. We should push harder, Senator. Strike while it's hot. Force the issue. Own the narrative. No, we need to cool the temperature. You've made the statement. Let the dust settle before we risk alienating allies. If we don't lead now, someone else will. If we push too far, we could lose what ground we've gained. JD listened, weighing each word. The debate mirrored the storm outside, loud, urgent, and full of risk. But beneath the clamor lay the quiet truth. No path forward came without cost. And as the voices filled the room, his mind returned again to that photo of the Ohio farm, to the mayor's call, to the faces on those screens. They don't care about our strategy meetings, he thought. They care about what we do. The next morning brought the moment that would test that resolve. The House chamber, still heavy with the echoes of the night's debates, prepared for the vote that would decide the bill's fate. The margin was razor thin, too thin for comfort, too thin for certainty. As the final tallies came in, the tension was so thick it seemed the chamber itself had forgotten how to breathe. And then, the numbers. 215 in favor, 214 against. One abstention that would haunt discussions for weeks. A victory, but one so narrow it felt more like a warning than a win. That night, long after the reporters had filed their breathless stories and the pundits had staked their claims, JD stood alone at the window of his office, looking out over the city that seemed to glow with both promise and peril. The Capitol lights gleamed in the distance, steady as ever, but to JD they seemed somehow farther away. The vote was done. The bill had cleared its first, hardest hurdle. But deep down, he knew the truth that no headline could soften. The real battle was only beginning. The glow of victory from the House vote was faint and fleeting, fading almost as soon as it had appeared. J.D. Vance knew at the moment he stepped off the House floor, the press of congratulations already giving way to the harder, colder reality of what lay ahead. The bill had passed, barely. But the real test, the storm waiting on the other side, was the Senate. And J.D. could feel the winds of that storm gathering fast. The tension that had gripped the chamber the night before hadn't eased. It had only shifted, now settling like a quiet weight within his own party. The next morning brought no time for rest. Meetings filled J.D.'s schedule from dawn, and it was behind closed doors that the cracks within his own ranks became impossible to ignore. Thomas Massey, always frank, spoke with a bluntness that J.D. respected, even as the words cut. J.D., you're asking us to sign off on a blank check. $47 billion? How do we justify that to the people who sent us here? You think they want more debt? You think they trust us to spend it right? His voice was low but firm, the frustration beneath it plain. Ron Johnson, seated beside him, folded his arms, his gaze steady on J.D. Tom's right. We agree on securing the border. But this is fiscal insanity. You want to build a wall? Fine, but don't bankrupt the nation doing it. His tone wasn't angry. It was weary, as if he'd fought this battle before and seen where it led. J.D. let the words hang between them for a beat, weighing his own response carefully. The easy path, he knew, would be to make promises in the shadows. Concessions, deals, reassurances whispered behind closed doors that might buy a vote today at the cost of integrity tomorrow. But that wasn't why he had risen on the House floor, and it wasn't why he was here now. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but resolute. You know I'm not here for a headline. This isn't about politics. This is about our duty. To the people at the border who feel abandoned, to the law that we claim to stand for, to the future we want to leave behind. I'm asking for trust. Not for me, but for what we say we believe in. Massey's jaw tensed, his eyes flicking away for a second, as if searching for a counterpoint he couldn't quite name. Johnson exhaled slowly, the weight of J.D.'s words settling, but not erasing, his concerns. The room fell quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't agreement, but the space where doubt and conviction collided. JD could feel it, the hesitation, the pull of caution that, in another fight, he might have shared. But this wasn't another fight, and as the meeting drew to a close, he left with no promises made, no votes secured. Just the growing frustration of a man who saw the path forward clearly, but knew he might have to walk it with fewer allies than he'd hoped. Outside, the city moved as it always did, busy, indifferent, full of noise that masked the deeper struggles unfolding within its marble walls. And as JD made his way down the corridor, his thoughts remained fixed on the faces he'd seen on those news screens, on the voices that had called to him from towns forgotten by politics and promises alike. The House vote had been hard-won, but the Senate, that would demand more than words, more than quiet resolve. It would demand a fight that was only beginning. The city's noise did not quiet, even as J.D. Vance's meetings ended and his days stretched into nights. If anything, the storm outside the Capitol grew louder with each passing hour. What had begun as whispers and cautious headlines after the House vote had evolved into full-throated commentary, endless panels, op-eds, and sound bites dissecting his every word, his every move. One network called him Trump's shadow, suggesting he was no more than a mouthpiece for the former president's ambitions. Another dubbed him the last honest man on the Hill, a lawmaker who dared speak uncomfortable truths at personal cost. Stubborn, bold, reckless, heroic. The labels clashed across airwaves and screens, competing to define him before he could define himself. JD tried not to listen, but the voices found him. In headlines slid beneath his office door, in the clips his staff couldn't help but share, in the questions shouted at him whenever he stepped into view. Yet as the Capitol debated his intentions, JD chose to go where the cameras wouldn't follow, to places that didn't care about the latest soundbite or poll. He traveled quietly without press releases or televised speeches to the rural corners where decisions made in marble chambers often felt like distant rumors. Plain meeting rooms in small towns became his battleground now, spaces where he sat at folding tables, drinking bitter coffee, and listening more than he spoke. He met with senators representing regions where the border crisis wasn't just a headline, but a lived reality, where promises from Washington had long since lost their shine. There were no polished talking points in these rooms, just honest talks full of worry and weariness, of frustration with a system that seemed to spin endlessly without moving forward. JD answered questions as plainly as he could, offering no guarantees beyond the one that mattered most. I won't ask you to trust politics. I'll ask you to trust what you see me do. It was in one of those quiet meetings in a town so small it barely appeared on most maps that the moment came which JD would carry with him long after the votes were counted. An elderly rancher, his hands rough and scarred from decades of work, approached at the end of a meeting that had lasted hours longer than planned. There were no cameras to capture it, no staff to stage it, just two men standing in the fading light of a dusty room. The rancher reached out, his handshake firm despite the tremor of age. His gaze held JD's, steady and unblinking. "No one fights for us anymore," the rancher said, his voice low but clear. "Don't be like the rest." JD felt those words settle deep, heavier than any headline or insult that had been thrown his way. He gave no speech in return, no promise he hadn't already made. He simply nodded, his grip tightening for a moment as if to seal a silent pact. As JD left the town, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields that stretched beyond sight. The cost of conviction was clearer to him now, not measured in polls or punditry, but in the quiet hopes of those who had waited too long for someone to remember them. And as he headed back toward Washington, the storm in the Capitol seemed somehow smaller, its noise a distant echo beneath the promise that mattered most. The dust of the small town still clung to J.D. Vance's boots as he returned to Washington, but the city he stepped back into felt farther than ever from the places he'd just been. The Capitol, with its marble floors and vaulted ceilings, pulsed with tension. The air seemed thicker, the noise sharper, as the Senate chamber braced for a debate that had become more than policy. It was a battleground for the soul of the nation. Protesters swarmed the steps outside, their chants rising in waves that seeped through the stone walls. Inside, the galleries overflowed, voices shouting down at lawmakers below, a chorus of anger and desperation. Security guards moved quickly to keep order, but the storm was already inside the building. The debate began, and with it came speeches that burned with passion and fury. One senator declared the bill an act of moral duty, a line drawn at last in the shifting sand. Another railed against it as fiscal betrayal, warning of debts that would haunt generations. The chamber became a theater of sharp words and sharper glares, every sentence crafted for both history and tonight's news cycle. The clamor outside echoed within, protesters' cries mingling with the raised voices of those sworn to lead. And through it all, J.D. waited. He sat with hands folded, listening as the arguments rose and fell, his face unreadable. His mind held the faces of those ranchers, the words of that elderly man, the promises that felt heavier with every passing hour. When at last it was his turn, he rose slowly, the noise still swirling like a storm around him. But J.D.'s voice, when it came, did not rise to match the chaos. It was calm, measured, carrying the same quiet force that had filled the House chamber days before. "We were sent here not to speak louder, but to listen harder," he said. The room stilled, if only for a breath. "This bill isn't perfect. No bill ever is. But it is a beginning, and we owe our people that much." He spoke without flourish, without anger, offering no new promises beyond the ones he had already made. His words were not designed to win headlines, but to remind those seated around him why they had come to these halls in the first place. But when the vote came, J.D. knew before the numbers appeared that it would fall short. The margins were too slim, the divides too deep. The bill stalled, caught between passion and politics, conviction and caution. As the gavel fell and the chamber began to empty, voices lowered now to private murmurs and quiet frustrations, J.D. remained standing at his desk, still and silent amid the exodus. Reporters waited outside, pens ready to declare the bill dead, their stories already half written. The headlines would hit within the hour. Border bill falters in Senate showdown. Vance's effort falls short. Dead on arrival? The storm outside had not passed. If anything, it had grown. J.D. walked slowly through the Capitol's dim corridors, the echoes of his footsteps the only sound. The great building, so full of voices moments before, now felt hollow. He passed portraits of those who had fought other hard battles, other bitter wars of words. He wondered if they too had known nights like this, when the cause felt right, but victory remained out of reach. The real fight, he knew, had only begun. And as the doors closed behind him, the weight of that truth settled heavy on his shoulders. The Capitol's marble halls still echoed with J.D. Vance's solitary footsteps when the first reports began to break. He hadn't even reached the doors of his office when aides rushed toward him, their faces pale, their voices tight with urgency. A television mounted in a corner flickered with live images. The sound turned low, but the pictures loud enough. Los Angeles, flames in the night, crowds surging through downtown streets. And across the bottom of the screen, the banner scrolled. "Breaking news, protests turn violent as immigration enforcement escalates." J.D. froze, his breath catching as the images sharpened. Helicopter footage showed the city beneath a haze of smoke and flashing lights. Cars burned at intersections, sending pillars of black smoke into the night sky. Windows along entire city blocks lay shattered, glass glinting like ice beneath street lamps. Protesters and police collided in the streets. Tear gas clouds billowed. Figures staggered through the haze, some with makeshift bandanas over their faces, others simply running blind into the chaos. From another angle, a news crew's camera caught a storefront bursting into flame, the orange glow painting the faces of those who stood watching, their shouts drowned out by sirens. The city of angels looked for this terrible night more like a city at war with itself. J.D.'s aides spoke, but their words barely registered. His eyes stayed on the screen, his mind trying to take in the scale of what was unfolding. He had known tensions were rising. The protests had grown over recent weeks as enforcement measures increased along the border and in key cities. But this level of fury, of despair breaking loose into fire and smoke, It struck him with a force that no floor speech or Senate debate could match. Inside, JD felt it all at once. Fury at the destruction, sorrow for the city and its people, frustration that the promise of action had stalled while the nation's wounds only deepened. There was no satisfaction in being able to say, "I warned them." No room for vindication. There was only the sickening sense that while Washington argued, the streets had answered in flames. The room around him seemed to fall away. The voices of staffers softened to a distant hum. On the screen, an anchor's voice trembled as she described the scene outside City Hall. Police lines forming, protesters refusing to back down, flashbangs lighting up the night like lightning in a storm. The camera panned across graffiti freshly scrawled on government walls. "Remember us," it read. "No more promises." JD's fists clenched at his sides, the weight of that message hitting harder than any insult flung at him in the Senate. The people were no longer asking to be heard. They were demanding it, in fire, in shattered glass, in voices loud enough to echo all the way to the Capitol's quietest corners. He turned from the screen at last, his reflection catching in the dark glass of his office window. Beyond, the city lights of Washington flickered, calm and ordered, a world away from the chaos now consuming Los Angeles. But JD knew that distance meant nothing. The storm was no longer contained to one city. The storm had found its voice, and as he stood there, fury and sorrow warring behind his eyes, one truth settled heavier than all the headlines combined. There could be no turning back now. The images of Los Angeles burned in J.D. Vance's mind long after the screens dimmed. Even as the news cycle moved on to fresh angles and fresh outrage, those flames seemed to flicker behind his eyes, refusing to be extinguished. The weight of what he had seen, the broken glass, the desperate cries, the fire-painted skyline, pressed against him with every breath. And yet, as morning edged toward dawn, the storm inside Washington's walls had already begun to shift in tone. Where the night had been filled with fury and urgency, the day brought caution, calculation, and the quiet murmur of political self-preservation. His senior staff gathered in his office, voices low but firm, their faces drawn with concern. The tension was thick enough to choke on. "Senator, let it cool down," one of them urged, his tone measured, as if logic alone could tame the fire outside. "If you speak now, you risk inflaming the situation further. Let the city settle. Let tempers ease before you go out there." Another added, more gently, "There's wisdom in waiting. No one would blame you for taking a beat. The nation's watching. You only get one shot at this." JD listened, his gaze steady, his hands clasped before him on the desk. He heard the caution in their words, the fear beneath them. He understood it. But as their voices filled the room, his mind kept returning to those protesters, to the graffiti scrawled across broken walls. No more promises. The people weren't asking for patience. They were demanding action. Finally, his voice cut through the room's unease, quiet but firm. "When a house is burning, you don't wait to speak. You speak before the flames take it all." The words hung in the air, heavier than any argument that followed. There were no more objections. He rose, the decision made. There would be no waiting, no carefully staged performance. He asked for no speechwriters, no teleprompter. What needed saying had already written itself in his heart. He retreated to the quiet of his study, the weight of the moment sharpening his focus rather than dulling it. The Capitol's hum faded beyond the walls, replaced by the scratch of his pen across paper, as he gathered his thoughts not to impress, but to reach. By nightfall, the nation was watching. The networks cut live to his address, the frame tight on his face, the backdrop plain, no banners, no flags draped for effect. Just a man, a microphone, and the truth as he saw it. His eyes met the lens as if he were speaking to every American home at once. His voice was steady, stripped of the polish of politics, filled instead with the quiet urgency of a man who had seen too much to stay silent. "We don't need division," JD began, his words carrying over living rooms and city streets into diners and farmhouses, wherever the nation gathered to listen. "We need action, and we need it now." He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, not of enemies, but of neighbors, not of fear, but of courage. The speech lasted only minutes, but its echo stretched far beyond them. The response was immediate. The address went viral within hours, shared and replayed, praised and picked apart. Some hailed it as a voice of reason in a moment of madness. Others saw it as fuel poured onto the fire, but no one ignored it. And as JD stood alone after the camera stopped rolling, the weight of what he'd done settled on him, not as triumph, not as regret, but as the next step in a fight he could no longer walk away from. The glow of the cameras had barely faded before the storm broke loose. JD Vance's speech, raw and unpolished, was replayed across every network, dissected in op-eds, debated in town halls, and clipped into sound bites that flooded social media feeds by the millions. The nation that had watched him speak now roared with reaction, a wave of voices that both lifted him and threatened to pull him under. Supporters hailed him as a voice of courage in a moment of madness. Finally, one commentator declared, a lawmaker who says what needs to be said without hiding behind consultants and party lines. His words were shared with pride by border communities, by families who felt their struggles had been invisible for too long. Veterans groups, ranchers associations, small-town mayors, statements of support poured in, many simple, heartfelt. Thank you for standing up. We needed this. But just as swift, just as loud, came the critics. Cable panels tore into him, accusing JD of fanning the flames rather than helping to quench them. Dangerous rhetoric in a fragile moment, one anchor warned. He's inflaming tensions, not easing them, said another, their voice tight with indignation. Pundits debated whether his words had sparked new protests or merely reflected the fire already burning. Social feeds filled with arguments, some branding him a patriot, others a provocateur. And through it all, the headlines rolled out with relentless speed. Vance's speech divides America. JD Vance, leader or lightning rod. A senator's words, a nation's fury. Behind the noise, the reaction took a darker turn. His office phones rang constantly. Calls of support, yes, but also of anger. Threats veiled and unvarnished. Emails flooded in, some thanking him, others promising consequences. Staff filtered what they could, but the sheer volume of it bled through. JD read some of them in the quiet of his office, the words stinging not because they were unexpected, but because they spoke to a truth he could not ignore. The country was raw, the divisions were deep, and his speech, whatever his intent, had become a flashpoint no one could look away from. He moved through those days as if through a storm, steady on the surface but with the winds of the nation's anger and hope swirling around him. Meetings blurred together, statements were issued, interviews requested, declined, and always the question beneath every headline, what would JD Vance do next? When night finally brought a pause, JD found no peace in the walls of his office. He stepped into the cool air of the city and took to his car, driving without destination through the streets of Washington. The Capitol lay quiet now, its monuments bathed in soft light, its avenues empty, the chaos of the day left behind in newsrooms and living rooms. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of tires on pavement offered the only sound. As he drove, the weight of the last few days settled fully on him. He thought of the supporters who had written, of the threats that had come alongside the thanks, of the faces on both sides of the divide who now looked to him as symbol, target, hope, or scapegoat. And he understood, with a clarity that felt as sharp as the night air through the open window, that their fury wasn't truly aimed at him. They're not mad at me, JD murmured into the empty car, his voice low, more reflection than statement. They're mad at the truth. And with that thought, he drove on into the dark, knowing the road ahead had grown only harder. The dark streets of Washington faded behind him, but the storm inside JD Vance's mind did not. Days later, as his boots hit the dry, cracked earth of the Texas border, the weight of the nation's fury and hope traveled with him. The sharp, dry heat of the southern sun pressed down, the air thick with dust that clung to his skin, his clothes, his breath. It was a world away from the marble halls of the Capitol, but here, at last, was the place where all those debates and speeches, promises and protests had converged into reality. The fence line stretched for miles, a scar of steel against the wide, empty horizon. JD walked it slowly, each step stirring up small clouds of dust that clung stubbornly to his boots. Border agents met him along the way, their faces drawn with fatigue, eyes shadowed by too many sleepless nights. Their uniforms were worn at the edges, dust-stained and sweat-soaked, but their postures remained upright, proud despite the weariness. JD shook each hand with quiet respect, listening more than he spoke. Here there was no need for speeches. The stories poured out without prompting, of long nights and longer days, of crossings that never seemed to slow, of families separated by circumstance and law, of hope and frustration woven so tightly together that neither could be easily undone. Locals joined the agents along the fence, their expressions carved by sun and struggle. JD heard their words, their warnings, their worries, about safety, about livelihoods, about the slow erosion of trust in promises from far-off leaders. Every handshake, every glance seemed to carry a question unspoken. "Will you remember us when you leave?" And then, as the line of conversation ebbed for a moment, JD's eyes caught on a scene that stilled him more than any word could have. Near the base of the fence, where the land sloped unevenly and the barbed wire glinted under the relentless sun, children played. Two boys, their clothes faded and patched, kicked a dented tin can back and forth across the dust, their laughter light, untouched by the heaviness that surrounded them. A girl no older than 5 crouched nearby, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick, her dark hair falling in loose strands across her face. They were so close to the wire that it hummed faintly in the heat, a silent barrier between innocence and the storm of politics, law, and fear that raged beyond their understanding. For a long moment, JD stood motionless, watching them, the scene etching itself into his memory as deeply as any headline or speech ever could. The barbed wire cast jagged shadows across the children's play, the harsh steel a stark contrast to their soft voices, their laughter rising unguarded into the heavy air. No cameras were there to capture it, no reporters to narrate it for an audience. It was a truth too simple, too raw for headlines. Amid all the fury and debate, the speeches and the shouting, the cost of inaction and indecision was borne by those too small to have a say. As JD turned to continue down the line, his jaw set, his eyes hardened, not in anger, but in resolve. The stories he'd heard, the faces he'd seen, the innocence so close to the wire, they had given him what no debate in Washington could. He had come seeking clarity. Here, in the dust and heat of the border, he had found it. And as the wind carried the children's laughter out across the barren land, JD knew with certainty the time for speeches had passed. The time for action had come. The dust of the fence line still clung to JD Vance's boots as he stepped away from the hum of the barbed wire and the quiet laughter of the children. The sun hung lower now, casting long shadows across the barren land. But before him stood a different kind of shadow, one shaped not by wire or steel, but by grief. She waited near a modest building that served as both outpost and memorial, a woman who carried the weight of loss in the set of her shoulders and the sorrow in her eyes. JD approached quietly, his steps measured, his voice caught somewhere between duty and respect. She was younger than he had expected, the widow of the fallen agent. Her face bore the marks of sleepless nights and silent tears, but her gaze was steady, unwavering. She did not offer pleasantries or small talk. There was no place for that here. Instead, she reached into the worn pocket of her jacket and drew out a small object, its surface dulled with age and use, her husband's badge. Without a word at first, she pressed it into JD's hand. The metal felt heavier than its size should have allowed, as if it carried the weight of all the promises it once represented. JD held it between his fingers, feeling the edges, the engraving, the story it told without needing a voice. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, but carried more strength than any speech he had given. "Don't let his death mean nothing," she said. Her voice didn't shake, it didn't plead. It simply stated a truth, as plain and immovable as the land they stood on. JD searched for the right reply, but none came that felt worthy of the moment. The only answer that mattered, he knew, would be found in what came after. Later, as dusk deepened into night, JD stood alone at the agent's grave. The badge rested in his palm, cool against his skin as the desert breeze began to rise. The headstone was simple, a name, a date, a service remembered. No cameras bore witness, no reporters waited to record his presence. This was not for them. It was for the man who had fallen, for the family he'd left behind, for the promise that JD now felt etched into his own bones. He said nothing aloud. There were no speeches here, no declarations for history or headlines. But in the quiet, JD made his vow. I won't. The words formed in his mind, clear and certain, a promise as real as the stone before him. I won't let his death mean nothing. I won't let the voices fade. I won't walk away. The wind stirred the dry grass at his feet, carrying with it the faint sounds of the world beyond this small, solemn place. The murmur of agents returning to their posts, the distant hum of a town settling into another uneasy night. JD remained a moment longer, the badge still in his grasp, before finally turning back toward the path that would lead him from the grave, but not from the promise. And as he walked, the weight of that small piece of metal stayed with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the price already paid, and of the duty that now truly began. The dusty road from the small graveyard led J.D. Vance deeper into the heart of the land he had come to understand, not through briefings or maps, but through faces, voices, and the weight of sacrifice. The widow's quiet strength and that simple grave marker stayed with him as his vehicle rumbled toward a border town, so small it barely made the headlines, so weathered it seemed part of the land itself. No reporters followed, no cameras waited. This visit was not for show, it was for truth. JD stepped from the truck onto a main street lined with low buildings, some boarded up, some clinging stubbornly to life. A general store with faded signs, a diner where tired eyes watched through the windows as he arrived, a gas station with a broken pump, the dust thick around its base. The town felt like it had been forgotten by time and by Washington alike, and yet it endured. Its people endured. There were no speeches here, no staged meetings or carefully arranged photo ops. JD asked only for conversation, and he found it. They gathered in the back of the diner, where the coffee was bitter but hot. In the air carried the smell of fry oil and the quiet hum of an old jukebox that hadn't played in years. Ranchers, shop owners, a school principal, a retired deputy, faces lined with sun and worry, voices heavy with the weight of too many promises, broken by too many politicians who had come and gone. They spoke of their anger first because that was the easiest to give voice to. Anger at a system that felt blind to their struggles, at policies made far away that seemed to help no one, at the sense that the border was not just a line on a map, but a wound that no one was willing to close. JD listened, nodding, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, his eyes meeting theirs without flinching. Then came the fear, quieter but deeper. Fear for their children, for what future there could be in a town slowly hollowing out. Fear of violence spilling over. Fear of what happened when people stopped believing anyone was listening. And beneath it all, hope. Fragile, but real. Hope that maybe, just maybe this time would be different. That J.D. Vance might not be like the rest. That the badge pressed into his hand, the promise at the grave, the simple act of showing up without fanfare might mean something after all. He asked few questions. He offered no easy answers. He simply listened, knowing that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is to hear what has been too long unheard. As the meeting ended and people drifted back to their homes, their shops, their lives, JD stepped outside. The desert stretched wide before him, the sun a low, burning disk sinking toward the horizon. The sky flared in shades of gold and red, the last light casting long shadows across the dust. He stood there for a long while, feeling the quiet settle around him, the weight of the trust those people had offered. Trust hard-earned, trust that could not be taken lightly. In that moment, JD knew the truth that would guide him forward. Speeches might stir crowds, laws might shift policy, but it was this, the listening, the understanding, the promises made in places like this, that would define what came next. The dust of the border clung not just to J.D. Vance's boots, but to his thoughts as he returned to Washington. The sun-baked faces of the townsfolk, the widow's plea, the laughter of children near barbed wire. They traveled with him, more real and lasting than the marble pillars of the Capitol that now rose once again before him. He had listened. He had walked the fence line. Now he had come back not to speak louder, but to speak one last time with the weight of what he had seen, what he had promised, pressing on every word. From the moment he set foot in the building, the storm was unmistakable. The Capitol pulsed with energy and tension. Protesters encircled it like a human tide, their chants a steady drumbeat that echoed through the stone. Placards waved in the air, messages clashing as fiercely as the views they represented. Inside, the media swarmed. Cameras jostling for position, reporters shouting questions JD didn't stop to answer. Their words blended with the noise outside. Is the senator willing to compromise? Is this bill dead on arrival? Vance, hero, or holdout? The chamber floor mirrored the chaos beyond its doors. One by one, senators rose, their speeches sharp-edged and burning with conviction or condemnation. Some declared the bill a moral necessity, a line drawn at last in defense of security and sovereignty. Others thundered against it as reckless, too costly, too divisive, a path to ruin disguised as reform. Voices rose, hands slammed onto lecterns, and the debate became not just about policy, but about identity, legacy, and the very soul of the nation. Through it all, JD sat silent, watching, listening, waiting for his turn. His heart pounded with the weight of the moment, but his face stayed composed, his gaze steady. When he finally stood, it was not with the fire of those who had come before him, but with a calm that somehow cut through the noise more sharply than all the shouting that had filled the chamber. He didn't appeal to party. He didn't wave a flag for one side against the other. His words reached for something older, deeper. This bill is not perfect, he began, his voice even, but carrying through the chamber like a steady drum in the storm. No piece of legislation is, but it is honest, and it is necessary. Because what we do here today is not for a party's gain or a headline's glory. It is for the people we claim to serve, people who are waiting, who are watching, who have waited too long already. JD didn't point fingers. He didn't lay blame. He spoke of duty, of promises made not in chambers like this, but in dusty towns, on quiet fences, beside graves marked by sacrifice. His words were plain, but heavy with meaning, and they fell into the space where all the fire and fury had left only smoke. When he finished, there was no applause, just a moment's stillness, brief but real, before the noise resumed. The shuffling of papers, the low murmur of senators conferring, the ripple of reporters hurrying to file their next piece. Outside, the chants rose louder as the vote approached, as the final stand began. And JD, standing in the chamber center, felt the storm closing in, but stood firm, knowing that in this fight, he had given all he had. The storm inside the Senate chamber reached its peak, and then, as all storms do, it broke, not with triumph, not with resolution, but with the quiet, heavy fall of defeat. The final vote tally came down, numbers JD Vance had half expected, but had hoped against the odds might change at the last moment. The bill faltered. The narrow chance he had fought so hard for slipped through fingers worn from trying to hold it all together. No cheers, no gasps, just the subdued rustle of papers being gathered, of chairs scraping back as senators rose, eager to escape the weight of what had not been done. The chamber emptied around him. Colleagues who had praised his conviction now avoided his eye. Those who had opposed him wore the tired satisfaction of men who believed the storm had passed, and that the world would now return to its old familiar shape. JD stood for a moment longer at his desk, unmoving, his hands resting on the wood as if feeling for something solid beneath him. Then quietly he turned and made his way from the chamber, each step measured, unhurried, as if the weight he carried demanded no less. Outside, night had deepened. Midnight cloaked the Capitol in shadow, the great dome luminous against a dark sky scattered with stars. The city, so alive with voices hours before, now lay still. The chants of protesters faded into memory. The media vans packed up. The commentators gone home to draft their takes for the morning's broadcasts. JD stepped onto the marble stairs, their surface cool beneath his palms as he leaned there for a moment, letting the night air steady him. For the first time in hours he felt the quiet, not the heavy, expectant silence of the chamber, but the kind that comes when all words have been spent, all arguments made, all votes cast. It was the quiet of the aftermath, and of knowing that whatever came next would come slowly, painfully, built not on victory, but on resolve. The clack of footsteps echoed behind him, light against the stone. A reporter, young, earnest, one of the few who had stayed, approached, her notebook in hand, her face drawn with the fatigue of a long night, but still searching for something true to carry back to her readers. She hesitated, then asked the question that hung between them like a bridge. "What now, Senator?" J.D. looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he drew in a slow breath, his voice steady, the words simple but unshakable. "You keep your promise," he said, "even when it hurts." There was nothing more to say. The reporter nodded, scribbling his words down as if they might matter more than all the speeches given that day. J.D. turned from the steps, his figure small against the vastness of the Capitol behind him, and began the walk back through the quiet city. Each footfall echoed softly, steady and alone, but without regret. The fight had not ended, the road had not vanished, and though the bill had fallen short, though the night belonged to those who claimed it was over, J.D. knew better. Promises were not measured in victories easily won, but in the weight of standing firm when the world chose to look away. The night air that had offered J.D. Vance a brief moment of calm on the Capitol steps soon gave way to the harsh light of morning, and with it, the weight of defeat grew heavier still. The headlines hit like hammer blows. Border bill dead. Vance's gambit fails. Senators stand leaves him adrift. Is this the end of J.D. Vance's clout? The same commentators who had once debated whether he was a hero or a lightning rod now seemed to agree on one thing. He had lost, and the cost would be high. And so it was. The phone calls that once came from allies grew fewer. The invites to strategy meetings, the quiet offers of partnership, the backroom nods of respect, all began to dry up. In the corridors of power, isolation settled around J.D. like a fog. Colleagues passed him with polite nods but avoided real conversation. Lobbyists who once waited outside his office now found other doors to knock on. Even some within his own party began to mutter that perhaps he had gone too far, risked too much, spoken too plainly. The storm he had weathered on the floor had followed him off it, and now it raged in whispers behind closed doors. Worse still were the threats. They came quietly at first. A harsh email here, a letter there. But as days passed, they grew bolder. Voicemails left late at night, words dripping with venom. "You'll regret this. You don't speak for us. Watch your back." J.D. read them, heard them, and filed them away in the same place where he stored the headlines and the silence of so-called allies. Not because they didn't matter, but because he refused to let them decide what came next. In those lonelier moments, when the Capitol's grand halls seemed to echo with nothing but his own footsteps, J.D.'s mind turned to the voices of the past, the voices that had shaped him long before he stood beneath the dome. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had lived through harder days, who had faced storms of a different kind, but had taught J.D. the one lesson that mattered above all. Loyalty isn't loud. It's what stays when the noise fades. He could almost hear the old man's voice, soft but sure. You don't measure a man by how easy the fight is. You measure him by whether he gets up when it's hard. The memory steadied J.D., as it always had. The Capitol, for all its marble and history, felt smaller somehow, its judgments less final. The cost of conviction had been high, yes. The price of standing for something had proven steep. But in that quiet space between the headlines and the threats, between the isolation and the doubt, J.D. found what he had known all along, that some fights mattered more than the comfort of safety. He stood in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the tall windows, and looked out at the night. His reflection stared back, tired perhaps, but unbroken. And as he turned back to his desk, to the work that remained, the words formed clear in his mind. Words he knew would guide whatever came next. If I fall for this, let it be for the right fight. The glow of Washington's city lights faded in J.D. Vance's rearview mirror as he left behind the marble monuments and echoing halls where power whispered and thundered in turn. What lay ahead was quieter, but no less important. Towns that rarely made the news, communities forgotten in the shuffle of headlines, places where the weight of politics was felt not in speeches or votes, but in the daily struggles of people simply trying to hold on. If the fight in the capital had isolated JD, the road now called him to reconnect, not with parties or polls, but with the Americans whose lives his promise had always been about. The highways stretched long and empty, cutting through fields that rolled on for miles beneath wide skies. Small towns rose like islands in the sea of farmland, clusters of homes and shops where everyone knew everyone, where school gyms doubled as meeting halls, and where the line between hope and hardship blurred more with each passing year. In these places, JD found what he'd come looking for. Not easy answers, but honest voices. The first stop was a town with a name few outside the state would recognize. The welcome was mixed as he expected. Crowds gathered, drawn by curiosity, conviction, or simply the chance to be heard. Some cheered when they saw him, hands raised in greeting, their faces lined with sun and hard work. Others crossed their arms, skeptical, waiting to see whether this was just another visit, another promise, another politician passing through. JD took it all in. The warmth, the wariness, the weight of expectation. He spoke not from stages, but from porches, parking lots, under the shade of old trees where people gathered with folding chairs and coffee cups. His voice, when he used it, was steady, not seeking to inspire with grand phrases, but to remind. The people who hold this country together aren't in those marble buildings, JD said, his eyes sweeping the faces before him. They're here, farmers who rise before dawn, officers who keep watch when the world sleeps, families who give more than they have to make sure their kids see something better. They're the ones who hold the line, and we owe them more than words. Some in the crowd nodded, the truth of it settling deep. Others remained quiet, guarded, as if weighing his sincerity against the long memory of promises made and broken. JD didn't try to win them over with charm or slogans. He listened. To the farmer who spoke of fields gone fallow because markets had shifted and no one in Washington noticed. To the mother who feared for her children's future in a town with shrinking opportunity. To the deputy who had seen too much and been thanked too little. In every handshake, every conversation, JD felt the same thread running through it all. A hunger not for speeches, but for action, not for heroes, but for honesty. The applause when it came was modest, but it was real. The protests when they rose were heartfelt, not staged. And in the mingling of cheers and challenges, JD found what he needed most. A reminder that the fight was never about headlines or history books. It was about these faces, these voices, these towns. As he left each gathering, the road stretched ahead once more, carrying him deeper into the heart of the country, deeper into the promise he had made. The heartland had called, and JD had answered. Not with easy fixes, but with the one thing he could give without fail. His presence, his ear, his word. The road through the heartland led JD Vance to many places, but none as heavy as the small cemetery where the service was already gathering under a sky streaked with the pale gold of early morning. Word had reached him days before. Another border agent had fallen, another family shattered, another reminder that the cost of the promises made in Washington was too often paid by those who stood watch far from its marble halls. Jerry D came not for the cameras, there were none, nor for the speeches. He came because the promise he carried weighed heavier now, because the faces he'd met, the hands he'd shaken, the stories he'd heard left him no other choice. The service was simple, as the family had wished. A few rows of chairs arranged beneath the broad limbs of an old oak, a plain wooden coffin at their center, draped in a flag that rippled gently in the morning breeze. The gathered crowd was small. Family, friends, fellow agents, men and women whose faces were lined not just by sun and age, but by grief held close out of respect for the one they'd lost. JD took a place toward the back, hands folded, head bowed, his presence quiet but steady. The pastor spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of a man who had stood the line with honor. The words were spare, but they needed no embellishment. The silence between them said as much as the prayers offered. When the time came, JD stepped forward. He moved with care, each motion measured, as if the air itself had grown heavier around him. Together with two agents, he helped fold the flag, the fabric crisp beneath his hands, its stars and stripes disappearing fold by fold until only a tight triangle of blue and white remained. The weight of it seemed out of proportion to its size, as if it held all the sorrow and respect of those who stood witness. JD placed the folded flag atop the coffin, his fingers lingering a moment on the smooth surface of the wood. He leaned in, his voice low, meant only for the one who now rested there. "You're not forgotten," he whispered, the words carried off by the breeze, but sealed in the promise he had already made. To the widow, to the heartland, to himself. As he stepped back, the family rose to meet him. The agent's widow, older than the last, her eyes rimmed with red but her gaze clear, took his hand in both of hers. She didn't speak at first, but the grip of her hands said more than any words could have. When she did find her voice, it was soft, steady despite the tremor of sorrow beneath it. "Thank you for standing with us," she said. "For standing with him." JD nodded, his reply simple but heartfelt. "It's where I'm meant to be." The service ended as it had begun, with quiet dignity, with the soft shuffle of boots on grass, with the low murmur of prayers shared and promises remembered. As the mourners drifted away, JD remained for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the small mound of earth, on the flag that lay atop it, on the oak tree that seemed to stand sentinel over them all. And as he turned at last to go, the weight of the flag, the family's thanks, and the silent oath he carried pressed upon him, guiding each step back to the road ahead. A road that, now more than ever, he knew he could not walk away from. The weight of the folded flag, the widow's quiet thanks, and the solemn silence of that small cemetery stayed with J.D. Vance as he returned to Washington. But something else traveled with him too. Something harder to define, but impossible to ignore. It began in the smallest of ways. Letters, emails, and calls from places that had once seemed silent. Town mayors, veterans groups, farmers associations, and border community leaders. All reaching out, not with anger this time, but with resolve. "We've waited long enough. We stand with you. Make them vote again." What started as a trickle became a steady stream. Quiet momentum built beneath the surface of the noise. It wasn't the headlines that changed. Those still debated JD's choices, still questioned his tactics, but the voices behind them grew louder, clearer. Across the heartland and beyond, people began to demand what JD had called for all along. Not speeches, not slogans, but action. Inside the Capitol, the tide was felt first as murmurs in hallways, quiet conversations behind closed doors. Senators who had once avoided JD's gaze now stopped him to talk. Not always agreeing, not always committing, but listening in a way they hadn't before. The math on the vote hadn't changed overnight, but the ground beneath it had begun to shift. Doubts softened. Positions wavered. A sense of inevitability, faint at first, began to take root. Perhaps the time had come. Perhaps the time was now. JD felt it too, the change in the air, the turning of the tide. But he carried it lightly. There was no triumph in his step, no boast in his words. He knew better. He knew how fast momentum could stall, how quickly resolve could fade. Humility kept him grounded. The faces of those he had met, the graves he had stood by, reminded him what was at stake. This wasn't about winning a vote, it was about keeping a promise. And so quietly, without fanfare, the Senate scheduled what no one had dared speak of just weeks before. A final vote. A chance to decide at last whether words would become action, whether promises would be kept. The chamber's calendar marked the date. The nation waited. And JD, standing at his office window, watching nightfall over the Capitol, felt the weight of what was to come, and the tide that would carry them there. The chamber held its breath as the final tally was read. Numbers that had once felt impossible now glowed on the board, just enough to pass the bill. The gavel's fall echoed through the room like the closing of a long, hard chapter. The bill was not perfect. J.D. Vance knew that. Compromises had been made along the way. Details softened to win the votes needed. But the heart of the promise he had carried, real support for the border, real relief for the communities long forgotten, had survived. That mattered more than any flaw. Around him, the chamber stirred back to life. Some senators shook his hand quietly. Others moved quickly to the next matter, eager to leave this battle behind. Reporters filled the corridors, their voices rising as they tried to draw him in. "Senator Vance, how does it feel? Was it worth the cost? What's next for you?" But J.D. Vance offered no speech, no victory statement for the cameras. He stepped past the microphones, past the notepads, waiting to capture his words. This moment wasn't his to claim. It belonged to the border agents who kept watch at night, to the families who had waited for change, to the towns that had trusted him when trust was hard. Outside, as dusk settled over the Capitol, J.D. paused on the steps, looking out over the city. The work ahead would be long, but tonight a promise had been kept. Days later, J.D. left the city behind once more. No press release announced his trip. No staff accompanied him. He flew south quietly, rented a truck without fanfare, and made his way to the place where his journey had begun, the border fence, stretching long and silent across the land. The sun hung low when he arrived, the desert painted in gold and crimson. The wind carried the scent of dust and sage, the only sound the quiet rustle of dry grass. J.D. stepped from the truck, boots crunching on the hard-packed earth, and walked toward the fence. He said nothing. There was no speech prepared, no audience waiting, just him, the land, and the line that had drawn him here so many times before. He walked the fence as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that reached out across the ground. His hand brushed the cool steel as he passed, fingers tracing the path where so many stories had played out unseen. He thought of the children playing near the barbed wire, of the ranchers and agents and families who had shared their hopes and fears. He thought of the graves, the folded flags, the voices that had urged him on. There was peace in the quiet, in the simple act of walking without purpose beyond remembrance. Each step felt like a chapter closing, not in finality, but in fulfillment. The promise had been hard won, the cost high. But here, with the wind at his back and the vastness of the border stretching before him, J.D. felt the weight of that promise settle at last. Not as a burden, but as part of the land itself. The sun slipped behind the horizon, leaving the sky awash in the deep blues and purples of approaching night. J.D. stood for a moment longer, the fence line before him, the empty land beyond. And then he turned, walking back to the truck, his silhouette long against the fading light. No cameras captured the moment. No headlines would tell of it. But for J.D., that was as it should be. The promise had been kept. The fight for now was done. Night draped itself over the city as J.D. Vance stood alone in his office, the soft glow of the Capitol dome visible through the window. The day's victory was behind him, but the weight of the journey remained. The faces of those he had met along the way seemed to fill the quiet. The widow who placed her trust in him, the children playing near the wire, the ranchers who had asked him not to be like the rest. He thought of the long road, the sleepless nights, the isolation that came with standing firm when others urged retreat. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, lined with fatigue, but unbowed. And in that moment, J.D. spoke softly, not for an audience, but for himself. "They called me stubborn. They called me naive, but they will never say I forgot them." The words settled into the stillness of the room, not as a boast, but as truth earned the hard way. Outside, the city prepared for another day, another fight. But for tonight, J.D. allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had kept his word, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. J.D. Vance's journey reminds us that true leadership is not measured by headlines, but by the promises we honor when no one is watching. His story is about resilience, quiet courage, and standing firm for those without a voice. It challenges us to ask ourselves, in moments that matter, will we choose what is easy or what is right? What promise in your life are you determined to keep, no matter the cost? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.